As global warming has us hovering on the brink of irreversible change, threatening to put entire cities underwater, nations have started to up their game when it comes to things like reducing emissions and getting greenhouse gases under control. But it may not be enough to halt the damage. Nations can't tackle this monumental challenge alone, but international cooperation has historically been a story of arguments, compromise, and ultimately weaker agreements that don't have the mojo necessary to force cooperation with environmental guidelines. Let's take a closer look at some of those agreements that have gotten us to where we are today. Our story begins in 1972 in Stockholm. This was the first environmental conference held by the UN. They briefly skimmed over climate change, but it really wasn't on the agenda yet, and nobody was concerned about it. This conference was responsible for the creation of the United Nations Environmental Program. The program has members elected from countries evenly distributed around the globe and is headquartered in Nairobi, making it the first to be situated out of the global north. However, as a program rather than an agency, it has limited governmental authority. In more recent years, there have been calls to upgrade it, but so far that has yet to be accomplished. In 1974, scientists proposed that certain chemicals were causing the thinning of the ozone. It wasn't until 1975 that the term global warming even became part of the public lexicon when Wallace Broecker used it as the title of a paper. By 1977, there was scientific consensus that CFCs, HCFCs, and halons cause ozone depletion. It wasn't until 1987, a decade later, when there was a gaping hole in the ozone above the Antarctic, that the Montreal Protocol was signed, which banned those chemicals. On the bright side, the Montreal Protocol was one of, if not the most, effective environmental agreements ever signed. First of all, it allowed restrictions on the chemicals to be tightened or loosened over time as science advanced our understanding of the issue. And it pushed countries to accept the protocol by creating trade restrictions that allowed signatories to trade only with other signatories. Once the more economically influential nations signed on, it was only a matter of course for everyone to get on board. In fact, all 197 member states of the UN signed it. Developing countries were given longer to phase out the use of chemicals, and various groups and funds were created to provide countries with resources, training, and research while they made the change. Even with these efforts, though, ozone levels aren't expected to recover until the mid-21st century. A year later, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was formed. The IPCC is supposed to be a non-biased entity that amalgamates scientific research on climate change into reports that assess the cause and extent of climate change and the impact of that on the environment and civilization. As the issues of global warming have become increasingly more apparent and urgent, the IPCC has been accused of being far too moderate and letting politics get in the way of definitively stating humanity's role in global warming sooner. In 1989, Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of the UK, warned about CO2 emissions and deforestation in an address to the United Nations. Among other things, she said this: "What we are now doing to the world by degrading the land surfaces, by polluting the waters and adding greenhouse gases to the air at an unprecedented rate, all this is new in the experience of the Earth. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. But the problem of global climate change is one that affects us all, and action will only be effective if it is taken at the international level. The challenge for our negotiators on matters like this is as great as for any disarmament treaty. The Intergovernmental Panel's work must remain on target, and we must not allow ourselves to be diverted into fruitless and divisive argument. Time is too short for that." In 1990, the IPCC published its first report. They said that over the past century, average global temperatures had risen by 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius. They also said that humans produce greenhouse gases, which could be assumed to have a warming effect on the planet, but they made no definitive statement that humans are a direct cause. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, all 197 UN countries signed the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC for short, which created a methodology for dealing with climate change. It set aside funding and created committees and groups that gave countries a way to have an ongoing conversation about climate change. The framework also designated a controlled set of gases, although no strict limits were set. At this time, countries also agreed to get their emissions back to 1990 levels. That didn't happen. In 1995, the IPCC published its second report. While still hesitant about assigning blame or creating a call to action, it was their first definitive statement that humans are a contributor to global warming. In 1977, the UNFCCC came together in Japan to sign the Kyoto Protocol. In this protocol, countries agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% by 2008 to 2012. The protocol also set up an emissions trading system and allowed countries to create joint projects on emissions reduction. The U.S. Senate said they wouldn't sign it, and George Bush pulled out of the process altogether after he was elected. The next year was the warmest on record. In 2001, the IPCC released a third report that said for the first time that humans are the main cause of global warming, and the Marrakesh Accords, created by the UNFCCC, were signed. This set up funds to help developing countries combat climate change and created guidelines on land use and forestry. In 2005, both the Kyoto Accord and the Marrakesh Accords went into effect for the signatory countries. Then, in 2006, the Stern Review was published, which said that if left unchecked, global warming would cause us to lose 5% global GDP each year due to reduced access to water, food production, and health, among other things. This was important because it was one of the first times that global warming was given a clear economic result and added yet another degree of importance and urgency to the situation. The next year, the IPCC published its fourth report, which stated that they were 90% sure humans are the cause of global warming in modern times. The UNFCCC met in Bali to draft the Bali Roadmap to create plans for what should happen after the Kyoto Protocol ended in 2012. There was hope to get something going by 2009. CO2 emissions continued to climb. By 2009, China had passed the US as an emitter of greenhouse gases. And, of course, there was the Copenhagen Accord, which was finalized amongst squabbling between countries. Overall, the Copenhagen Climate Summit was a bit of a disaster. The final document was not legally binding, and many of the leaders who were adamantly for strong measures to combat climate change were disappointed with how watered down it was. Basically, it just asked countries to submit goals for emissions reduction, but did little else. In 2013, the IPCC published another report, this time saying that they are 95% sure humans caused global warming since 1950. The Paris Agreement was signed and went into effect in 2016. This time, the US was a signatory, although not for long. Given how much attention this has gotten recently, let's take a closer look at its pros and cons. The first element of the agreement is a new goal to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with the hope of limiting it to 1.5 degrees Celsius if at all possible. If we were to actually achieve that goal, it would be great because it would keep major cities from going underwater. However, temperatures have already risen to 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and this wasn't accompanied by definite emission reduction goals, so while admirable, achievability is at question. Emissions output would have to drop to zero by the end of the century if we are to meet that goal. Next, the agreement has nations submitting their own goals for emission reduction. If all the pledges are met, it could reduce global warming by about 1 degree Celsius from what the levels would be otherwise. However, that is just not good enough. Even after emissions cap off, global warming will continue to increase. Based off of current pledges, temperatures would rise to 3.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The agreement does admit that stronger action will need to be taken, and therefore has nations submitting more ambitious goals every 5 years. The signatories agreed to improve the ability of societies to overcome issues that global warming causes. This includes the promise to increase support and preparedness in at-risk areas. Furthermore, the Paris Agreement asks developed countries to raise $100 billion per year from 2020 to 2025 to support emissions reductions in developing countries. The nice thing about this is that the conversation has started to drift away from which countries have leeway when it comes to emissions to which countries should pay to put a stop to it. However, the agreement doesn't have any stipulations about how much countries should pay. Instead, governments choose how much and when. Another section of the agreement says that there will be increased transparency between countries, with consistent reports of current emission levels as well as openness about goals and projects. Again, this is admirable, but the how is the problem. It leaves emissions testing up to the country being tested, which means that there is still plenty of room for corrupt practices and misrepresentation. An element not seen before is the recognition of the role entities other than national governments have to play in solving this problem. This includes the private sector as well as cities and other municipalities. So, overall, is the Paris Agreement good or bad? Goals are nice, but the question is, how do we meet them? The Paris Agreement sets lots of goals, but doesn't say how we are supposed to meet them. There's no carrot or stick for getting countries to take action, and therefore no enforceability. Many of the past climate agreements had similarly admirable goals that were left unmet. So while it's a great first step, there is still a lot to be done. We can't just sign pieces of paper to feel better, although that's a place to start.